All right, everyone, welcome. Welcome to this edition of Coffee and Containers. This series is designed to provide our community with information and conversations around CloudNative, microservices, and Kubernetes related content, and really about the amount of time that it takes you to drink a cup of coffee. I've got my cup here, and so before it gets cold, I will have it finished. I am Jim Schultz. I'm a developer advocate at Shipa Corporation. I'm also the founder of North American DevOps Group, and I'm going to be the host and moderator for today's discussion. The topic today, this is a really long title. We couldn't figure out a way to pare it down, and we really like what we came up with, so we're going to read the whole thing. The topic is Fearless Delivery with an End-to-End DevOps Platform, and the subtitle is Leapfrog Over Your Kubernetes Obstacles. And we loved Leapfrog because we do have a guest here from JFrog today, Melissa McKay. She's a developer advocate at JFrog. She'll be one of our panelists. And then our friend Bruno Andrade, who's the founder and CEO of Shipa. He will be one of our panelists as well. Essentially, we're going to discuss and speak about the specific Kubernetes related challenges with this panel here today. So Melissa and Bruno, welcome. Maybe each of you can just take a couple of seconds to briefly introduce yourselves before we get started. And Melissa, maybe we can start with you.
Sure. So I am a developer advocate with JFrog. I started that position about a year ago, so I'm coming up on my year anniversary. Pretty exciting. Before that, I was a software developer for a good 20 years in some way, shape, or form. So I've been on many different kinds of teams, small ones, big ones, and a few different companies, large ones, small ones, and have had lots of experiences across the board. So I come with a lot of background from that area, just from being a developer, and I'm really excited to talk about with Bruno today about Shipa and what they offer, of course. The last couple of years, my experience has been on a DevOps team. So that has come with a whole nother world to me. There's a lot of tools out there. I was introduced to a lot of different tool sets to make our developer lives easy. JFrog was the perfect company for me to start with in order to make that journey more successful for a lot of us.
Nice. Very cool. Well, thank you for being here and joining the conversation with us here today. Very
Thanks.
excited to have you. And Bruno, if you'd like to just say hi real quick.
Yeah, sure. So I'm one of the founding members here at Shipa. My previous roles, basically, I was a sysadmin, right? I like to say that I was a sysadmin before we had the fancy titles of DevOps engineers or SREs and all that stuff. Basically, sysadmin all the way from kind of physical servers, virtual machines, and being fortunate enough to see that evolution. I did another startup before this one, also kind of the cloud native space, more around the infrastructure. I then realized the problem was moving up the stack on offering kind of the DevOps and DevSecOps a streamlined platform. So that's when we started Shipa, and I used to say that my main role before, when we had offices and before COVID, was to hold the Costco card and make the purchases, making sure everyone has coffee and Red Bull and whatever they need. But these days are gone, so I'm trying to figure out my space. So that's a little bit about me.
Cool. Thank you, Bruno. Thank you very much. Let's jump straight into the conversation here, if that's okay with you guys. So I'd like to start by talking about artifacts and artifact repositories. Obviously, we have JFrog here, and they've got the Artifactory solution. But many of us have been managing repos in the world of monolith or traditional applications. But I'd like to ask both of you, what's different in the cloud native world? How do we get started? What are some best practices? How do we most efficiently deploy? I know that's a really long question, but Melissa, maybe we can start with you first on that one.
Yeah, definitely. So differences in the cloud native world. I think the best thing I can point out there is just there are so many more binaries, libraries, dependencies every day than ever before. So it's becoming a thing. It's becoming more difficult to manage. It's like buying a new pair of shoes every day, and you've got to stuff them all in the same closet, and then you got to find the pair you wanted to wear that day. That's a horrible analogy, but you've got me. So I like shoes. And,
I only have
that's
3
what my
pairs.
closet looks like.
I have a lot of shoes. I have too many shoes.
I have 3 pairs. I make my life easy.
Yeah. So yeah, we have a bunch more tool sets and automation that have abstracted a lot of that away from us. And I know as a developer, when you first start out, I was a Java developer for a lot of my professional career. And when you first start out, you're taught how to use, Maven or Gradle, these automated build tools. And a lot of that, when you're first starting, it's just kind of magic what happens under the covers. You just run a command, and that's it. And your application is built. Everything gets pulled in magically, and you just move right along on your day. Well, when I started working on more DevOps focused teams, I started realizing, especially when we started getting into problems with conflicts between dependencies, I started realizing just how much our simple apps now are pulling in hundreds, thousands of dependencies from all over the place. And if you don't pay attention to where they're coming from, that can be a huge issue for you. In order to continue delivering our software that we do today reliably, we need to know 3 things. These are the things I always go back on. What is our bill of materials for our application or our service? And I'm gonna, since we're recording this around lunchtime, I would like to go off on this analogy of a restaurant, right? Or a meal that we're being served. Do we know what the ingredients of the dishes that we're serving? What if something is missing? Are we going to be able to tell if something's missing? And are we going to be able to reliably reproduce it? Do we have a solid recipe that can be repeated? The next thing that we would really care about is, where are these ingredients coming from? So if I happen to have a dish that has these, beautiful mushrooms in it, and they are from, somebody went out to a specific place in the forest and picked these mushrooms, are we going to be able to depend on those always being there for when we want to build again? And who maintains these things? Who updates our dependencies? Who stores them? These are all things that we need to care about a little bit more. And then lastly, are our ingredients safe? I brought up mushrooms. What if we go out and pick our same mushrooms from the forest and it turns out one of those things is poisonous? That's a big problem for us. And in the context of apps, that can be some huge, security hole or vulnerability of some type. So real quickly, because I know I'm kind of talking a lot about this subject, this is the JFrog portion here. I want to show you really quick just how easy it is to set up repositories, and then make a couple of suggestions on how you might organize them. So I'm going to share an Artifactory instance here. I
love the mushrooms analogy, because that is one thing that you have to make sure you pick the right one.
Yes, definitely. They might look very similar. All right, this is a simple instance that I just used to show demos and stuff. But Artifactory is definitely JFrog's flagship, so to speak. So that's what most people are familiar with. And this is the general view that people are used to. Last year we did, JFrog culminated everything into the JFrog platform, which includes not only Artifactory, but some other things as well. So those are interesting things to check out. But for now, we're just going to talk about Artifactory today. So this is the typical view that people see of repositories. As a developer, I didn't really have a lot of experience in how these things were set up or configured or organized. And I found out later that we could have done a lot better organizing our stuff. Generally, what we would do is we would just fill out a ticket and say, hey, we need a repository to put our stuff. And then we would just be handed something to work with. And what I see often is huge, like one repository for everybody. It's being used for everything. And there's a couple problems with that. A lot of it has to do with like maintenance of your artifacts. When you want to get rid of something, it's a little bit harder to tell who's using it. So in Artifactory, repositories are really cheap and it's pretty easy to make them. As you can see, I have plenty of repositories here all over the place. In our administration section, this is how repositories are created. There's 3 different kinds. So these are organized in local repositories, which these are all of the artifacts that you create. You know, they're not artifacts that you've pulled from third parties or anything. These are the ones that you create. Our remote repositories are repositories that are third-party artifacts. These are the ones that we really need to keep an eye on and keep track of. And then we have virtual repositories, which these, I'm going to open one up so that you can see what this looks like. This is gives you the capability to include any number of repositories into a single reference point. So you can hand this single reference point to your developers and they have access to everything. Now, what we recommend is you should really make repositories or registries. I have a feeling we're going to talk about containers a little bit more here. But you really should be organizing these not only in your local, remote, and virtual repositories, but you should organize based off of project and then off of maturity. So whether this is a dev artifact, whether this is a testing artifact, whether this is a staging artifact or a production artifact. By doing that, there are some advantages there to protecting your environments. And I'm excited to talk a little more about Shipa and how Shipa protects these environments as well in the future. Anyway, I just wanted to show you this real quick to show you how easy it is to create repositories.
And one question on that is, I agree with you, managing a single repo with everything inside, it gets really messy at some point. But yes, with the whole microservice architecture that my monolith application is being broken into, I don't know, 5 or 10 different services, do you see that also creating a mess if you don't manage it properly, especially if you start breaking down my services between dev, QA, and production? Now suddenly one single app becomes 30 artifacts sitting on my repo. Do you see people struggling with that? And if yes, like anything that you advise them to do to keep that under control now that they move to microservices?
Yeah, I would definitely split up your repositories to represent each microservice. Now, your first thought might be, well, that's a lot of storage space. If I've got 5 microservices and they're all using the same artifact for some base function, that doesn't make sense to store that in 5 different places. And one of the advantages that Artifactory provides you is they use a checksum storage. So that one artifact that's actually shared between many different repositories is really only stored once. Nice. There's a database working in the back end that tags that artifact to indicate that it is a part of different repositories. The other advantage of doing that is you can better control your access to artifacts. So you won't necessarily have a person from one project accidentally deleting something that another project needs. Right?
That never happens.
So, never. I've never seen that happen in my whole career. All right, the last thing I just wanted to show is just how many package types are available. Obviously, there's more and more that we add. We also have the option of a generic type. So if we don't happen to support the package with the metadata as expected, you can always create a generic type. Also, we do support Docker containers, not just Docker containers, but OCI images as well. So anything that is compatible with OCI, you can use in your Docker registries here. That was something that I thought was a huge advantage because not only can you have your image there, but you can also have all of the dependencies that compose to that image. They're all in the same place.
And do you have a breakdown of what's the type of package that people are hosting the most on JFrog today, or the one that it's growing the most over the last little while, for example?
I don't have that.
No problem. No,
I mean, we have all kinds of installation types, right? So there's on-premise types, so we don't really have access to that data on-premise. We do have our cloud stuff that we can get some of that data from, but we generally go off of, language popularity. So that's obviously true. Like NPM is huge. A lot of those. Yeah.
And I asked that because I saw, well, Docker is one, and I saw Helm as well. And because now people adopting kind of cloud native and Kubernetes and these things,
Yes.
curious to see kind of the growth curve there
Yes.
for Docker and Helm packages, for example.
Now, images are especially interesting because they take up a lot of space, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And Artifactory uses the layer caching. So they're careful to make sure that, a certain layer isn't going to be duplicated over and over among all of your images. That can be a pretty big deal when you, especially in your continuous integration pipelines and stuff, you're constantly rebuilding and pushing new images out there.
I agree.
All right, thank you, Melissa. Bruno, maybe we can shift to you. Do you want to talk a little bit about, so once we've built our repository,
Mm-hmm.
what are some things that we need to think about when we're deploying now in a cloud native environment with this repository?
Yeah, let me try to share my screen. Let me see, this is the desktop one. Too much technology these days to try and learn how to share a screen. It's getting difficult. But on our end, we feel there's a lot of there's a lack of a workflow, right? And what I mean by that is you have, and that's one of the things I like about JFrog is that you have not only the artifact there repository, but you also have more to your workflow, right? I know we're going to talk a little bit about more on the other topics, but you have your artifact repos there, you have your CI pipelines, and you also have a security process in there, right? Because we say that, right, storing your artifacts is just part of it, right? But now, how do you plug this into your CI pipeline, and how do you plug this into the end to where you want to deploy, or the end environment? In our case, we focus a lot on the Kubernetes or the cloud native space. So we see that, great, now I have my artifact register in there, but now getting that from there to my Kubernetes cluster, it involves a lot of other steps, right? So Kubernetes is very object-centric. So me as a developer, I have to learn what deployment sets are, what ingress rules are, and so on. So that's where Shipa comes in, removing that complexity and getting the artifact from JFrog Artifactory, for example, and deploying that artifact for you as a developer, where you don't have to worry about creating or learning how to manage those YAML files or those objects. An example I can say is, if we come in here and I have an application, for example, called JFrog that I deployed yesterday, and I'll show later how that is integrated into the pipelines. But I created an application with Shipa, and that application is sitting on what we call a pool. A pool is a way, or is a framework for you to enforce controls and guardrails. So when creating a pool, you're basically defining things such as CPU and memory that your applications can consume, the level of security scans, and that can be tied directly to your X-ray. So it's which teams can deploy that pool and to what clusters that pool is tied. So GKE or AKS, for example. So your developer, the only thing your developer sees is basically the pool. Your developer doesn't need to interface with Kubernetes or the infrastructure directly. Your developers creates the application and deploys the application artifact. So one way I mentioned is I create an application, point to an existing pool, and directly from here, an example of deploying that from the interface is I basically can point it to my JFrog Artifactory or my Artifactory image. And as soon as I do this, Shipa will make the pool directly from Artifactory. It will create all the objects that are required to run that application, all the dependencies required, and deploy that directly on Kubernetes. And it's going to give you a pretty good view of, okay, here is my image that I pulled from Artifactory. And here are all the objects and the status that I have that were created by Shipa related to that deployment. So I can see exactly the dependencies for my app, the objects, the status, more information, as well, not only from an object dependency, but actually from a network dependency or network map. So you can see everything that is coming in or out of your service, the other services it is communicating with. So now between Artifactory and Shipa, for example, now you have a full delivery pipeline, I would say, and management of your application post-deployment. And I think that's what's been missing a lot when we talk to enterprises, especially that full visibility of your pipeline, all the way from storing the image to supporting my application post-deployment. Does that make sense?
This makes sense. And this, I can add this to our restaurant analogy. You guys are setting the table and handling the delivery of the food and handling all of that stuff. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah, I like to, I use a pizza analogy, right? Because I'm a huge pizza fan. And
I knew that was coming.
Exactly. So today what we see a lot is people really get stuck on trying to put together all of the ingredients, right? The pepperoni, making the dough, and those are all, we reference those as the objects, right, for their application. So you have to put in your image, then your ingress rules, then your deployment sets, then your cluster, then this and that, and security scan, and tying this all up together. If you're doing this for a small service or a small number of services or a small team, you may get around with it, right? But as you scale, and we work with companies that are deploying 100, 200, or 500 services across thousands of developers, this is just a nightmare, right? So if you can have an integrated process that basically brings those ingredients together for you automatically and allows you to focus on eating the pizza, which is the part I like, it's just a win situation, right?
This makes sense because in my experience, this is where my teams and myself personally have gotten stuck. You know, we've learned the code, we've learned how to write our functions and put everything together and build our project, and we're comfortable with CI pipelines now. We've learned how to commit our code and how that triggers a build. We're starting to get comfortable there, but now we have this whole deployment infrastructure to worry about. And it just isn't efficient for everybody to know everything. It just takes too much time. I mean, like I said, I've been doing this for 20 years. There's just no way that one person can know everything. So the first time I got frustrated with this, I'm like, I just want to know. I want to understand how this works. And I want to learn more about Kubernetes. Not saying you shouldn't do that. I think that's a wonderful thing to do. But one of the first resources I came across was through Microsoft Azure. They provided this. It was a PDF. It was called like 50 days from zero to hero in Kubernetes. And I'm like, oh, great. This is great. 50 days? 50 days of my life. Now, granted, it's a wonderful resource. But I mean, when I've got a feature I need to get out, I don't have 50 days to learn before I can get that feature out and deployed, tested, go through all those stages that I need quickly. That is a really lot to ask for, especially when your teams are constantly being mixed in with junior devs. It's really, demotivating to think you're never going to get anything done because you can't learn from beginning to end how to get an app out there and deployed.
Yeah, and going back to the pizza analogy that I like is, I think there is power in learning Kubernetes, right? And there is power in learning serverless, Docker. Knowledge is power, right? But I think different folks, they have to focus on different things at the end of the day. I learned to bake pizza because I like it, right? And I can make pizza for me and my family of 4. But if I'm bringing 10 or 15 friends over, pre-COVID, by the way, if I'm not going to do that, right? Because I'm going to be, instead of being with my friends and learning how they are and so on, I'm going to be stuck in the kitchen doing all that thing for them. And it's the same thing. The developer, it's awesome if you have the time to learn these technologies. But at the end of the day, the value that the developer delivers is on the application delivery, right? And the value a lot of the DevOps and the platform engineers they deliver is controls and guardrails. So if you can do that without having to interface with a complex technology and spend time on that, I think it's huge for you as a professional as well as for your organization.
Those guardrails, those are important. It is no fun to learn by trial and error in a production environment, which can happen a lot, especially if you put a developer whose expertise is on developing code, just throw them into the deployment ocean and have them figure it out. It's one thing to learn the basics of Kubernetes and learn how everything works, but then there's all of those details the security, the protection, that kind of stuff that, might get missed.
I agree. And since you mentioned the ocean, I'll hijack Jim's question. JFrog has an interest concept of the liquid software, right? So how do you see that apply to kind of the DevOps world today?
All right, so yeah, liquid. I have a cute little prop here. This is my JFrog squeeze toy. I use it a lot, so I have to get him replaced. First thing that goes are his eyes. But just notice that, that little splash logo here. So that's the whole liquid software, and JFrog always uses that phrase. And what that really means is that the ideal situation is that software in its whole life cycle, you should be able to put in a change, and that change should flow automatically and easily all the way through to the end to production. Now, a lot of projects aren't there at that ideal place yet, and there's a lot of reasons for that. That's just one example of a continuous deployment software or pipeline, and that is that flow. Usually we often see, continuous delivery pipelines. That means, everything's automated and stuff, but there is that one extra step that somebody has to push that button to actually deploy to an environment. And like I said earlier, a lot of devs, we get stuck at the continuous integration where we have that set up. We've got our builds automated, our unit testing automated, but then what? Then what do we do? So yeah, I see this tool. I see some pretty strong use case scenarios here, especially for like staging environments, testing environments, on top of your production environment, to make this a little bit easier for different teams to get their software through these quality gates and out the door faster.
And how does that translate a little bit into the CI pipelines, for example, that I have with JFrog? What some of the features that I have there that are available to me if I'm using the JFrog pipeline, for example?
Sure. So yeah, JFrog added pipelines actually the same month that I first started with JFrog. I was pretty excited about it to look into those, and those are available to play with too from you can try them out for free just to see how they work. And there are steps that you can add to your pipeline. You can have this final step that after you've run all of your tests and they pass. Maybe you run another set of integration tests and they pass. Maybe you run through X-ray scanning, like looking for any vulnerabilities, and that passes. You want to move all of that to, it's close to the beginning of the pipeline as possible. And then at the end, everything's passed, everything's golden. You can trigger a deploy directly from the pipeline to a Kubernetes cluster.
Nice. That's pretty awesome. And I spent some time playing with pipelines and the integration with Artifactory and getting the apps deployed, and it can be pretty good in terms, especially the way you visualize your whole pipeline and the triggers. It's pretty cool, actually. Yeah,
it's pretty powerful. There's a lot that can be done there. I do like the user interface, the GUI interface. It's pretty revealing, showing you what's actually going on. Just to note too, I mean, we do have the CLI behind the scenes. You can use that to automate your processes even further, so you're not stuck with, clicking around in the web if you don't want to.
That's pretty awesome. I have a demo here of kind of what I've done with pipelines a little bit, or do you want to show something before I show?
I want to see what you've done. I want to see this in action. I'm really curious.
But yeah, by the way, I did. Just real quick, I want to mention I was sharing the link to the white paper on the JFrog website about liquid software. I'll include a link to that so people can download that in the description of this video as well. So look for that if you're watching this video.
Nice. So don't laugh. That was my first pipeline built with JFrog pipelines. But I really like how you can build your different integrations. In my case, I have an integration. I have three basically. One into Artifactory. So I'm using my own JFrog Artifactory to where I build and store my image there. The second one is I'm integrating into my personal GitHub repo, which basically is an application called I call it JFrog pipeline, but it's an application called pod info for Kubernetes. And last but not least is I'm integrating into Shipa. So I'm passing a few environment variables to Shipa so I can run a full pipeline between JFrog, Artifactory pipelines, and then Shipa deploying to my cluster. And what I did is I have my pipeline here, which I love this view actually, where you can see that I'm running the Docker build, I'm running the push, I'm publishing my image, and last I'm deploying my my application to Kubernetes through Shipa. And the application that I'm deploying, if you originally see this application, let me see if I can find the original repo. And yes, I'm using Microsoft Edge. Everybody asks me about it, but it's pretty good. So with the original pod info application, I would have to create like a Helm chart. So me as a developer, I would have to learn what the deployments are and create basically this entire YAML file. I would have to learn ingress rules and create those for me as well for my application, my services, service account, and others. So because I'm deploying to Kubernetes through Shipa, I basically remove all of that. And if you're looking on my pipeline today with JFrog, what I'm doing is I'm pulling my image from my pipeline, from my JFrog pipeline repo. I'm doing the Docker build and the Docker push, where I'm basically saving that image into Artifactory. What did I do? I lost, oh, there you go. I'm basically storing that image into Artifactory. And as soon as it is done, what I'm doing is I'm deploying to Shipa, right? So me as a developer now, I don't have to learn what Kubernetes is. I don't have to see what, is it GKE? Is it AKS? Is it version 117 or 120 now? What are the deployment versions and API versions that I have to use? I don't have to learn or interface with any of that. I just get my application and I deploy my application pointing to the pool that my DevOps person gave to me. And that's it. I'm just deploying my image or I'm deploying my application code. And through the CI pipeline, I can do that everything directly from here and I can see the log. So that's a pretty cool view, I think. So you can see the individual log, the steps and the status of each. So it's pretty nice. Does it make sense? Is it too bad as a first pipeline?
This is beautiful. This is absolutely beautiful. I mean, so I'm all about the simplest thing that works, right? What is the simplest thing that I can get up and running and be most efficient with, right? The more complicated we get, that's when we run into, more and more difficulties. So yeah, abstracting away a lot of the detail. And I like that pipelines, I mean, I see that you used, a basic bash script step. That's really, really powerful. Yeah. On top of that, which allows you to, do pretty much anything, we have a lot of other native steps available too, like you have a promote build step and publish build info step. All of those are available for you to use. Pretty nice.
And I found that all available as part of the documentation and a few samples, so it was easy enough for me to do. And awesome. The interesting thing is because I'm deploying this all directly from from my GitHub repo, Artifactories, pipelines, and then Shipa on Kubernetes. As soon as your app is deployed, as a developer, I can come to Shipa and I can see my endpoint is available to me, and my app is already deployed, and I can access my app. Again, I don't need to learn Istio, Ingress, how to create an endpoint on Istio, and all that stuff. I can see some detailed information as soon as I start having access or to my app. I can see transactional information, how much my app is consuming, where are my units distributed. If I'm using a multi-regional cluster, for example, I can see that here. And tied to X-Ray, I can see security scans that may have been executed, any vulnerabilities found, and so on. And also my network policy. So now I have kind of a full, and that's what I like doing. What I like about that integration is between Shipa and JFrog, you have kind of the whole DevOps, DevSecOps, and developer kind of workflow streamlined between them from beginning to post-production or post-deployment.
Nice. So I'm curious, any developer can set this up. Any developer can go out there, get a little, instance of Artifactory, set up some pipelines. and push to a cluster. And so as a result, we have all of these protections around our clusters, and they're usually at the level of, maybe if you've got your clusters in Azure, you've got all of your identity management and access management there. I'm curious if I have a hold of this pool, what are the protections that Shipa gives me? And it helps me to not destroy production on accident.
Not that this actually happens, right?
I've never seen that happen either in all of my years.
Exactly. Let me see this one. So you can create pools either from the dashboard or from the CLI. And what you were setting is, for example, one example we always use during demos is a cinema service, right? Where I'm deploying my cinema UI, I'm deploying an API gateway, and I'm deploying a payment service. And I create different pools for these services because the different pools are going to have different security controls and guardrails, right? So one example is I'm setting up here a pool called Cinema Services. And the plan is basically how much memory and CPU the applications deployed to that pool can consume. So I'm setting up some guardrails there. In terms of security, what level of security scans that you want to run and any vulnerabilities you want to allow. And this can be, again, tied to X-ray. So you make sure that the vulnerabilities that X-ray identify, if it's not matched with the vulnerability exceptions that you have open here, Shipa basically blocks the deployment for you. Which teams can deploy, how many apps the team can deploy. You can say all the way down to what JFrog Artifactory this can come from. So you can say my images can only come from my pipelines, for example, repo from JFrog. If it's coming from anywhere different, basically block the deployment. So you have some controls and guardrails. And last but not least, this controls around the network policy. So you say every app deployed basically can get a zero trust. So no network connections coming in, no network connections coming out. So you can enforce all these guardrails that the developers, they don't have to worry about. And you as a DevOps, you don't have to learn about how do I enforce this on Kubernetes, right? How do I enforce that through and build YAML scripts, build Terraform and all the complexity. So those are some of the guardrails that are enforced automatically.
Excellent. I can see, so now when you're setting up your users and everything for your Azure cluster, for example, maybe only your platform team needs that. You don't ever need to provide that to every developer who ever wants to deploy anything. And I've seen that mess as well. Yeah, this is really nice.
And it becomes a good point for you as a platform engineer, because later, if you want to move from AKS to GKE or to EKS, for example, if you want to move clusters later because of a company strategy or because version or because whatever reason you have, you can move these clusters out. And as long as you plug them into Shipa pool, doesn't really matter if you're moving from GKE 117 to AKS 120, for example. For the developer, it's exactly the same thing. Nothing changes, doesn't really change the development workflow, but allows the kind of DevOps and platform engineering to own the background and change as they need. Beautiful.
How much access do developers have to that visual, like being able to see all of the statistics and all of that observability stuff that you have in there? That looks pretty cool.
Yeah, that's so from a dashboard perspective, your developers can have access to as much as you give them access. And Shipa runs a very kind of detailed permission list. So you can say a developer can only come here and create an app and deploy an app, but he cannot see logs, he cannot see dashboard, he cannot read events, or maybe he can see everything related to the app. So it's really detailed down to the level that you need to allow your developer just to come in, deploy, or someone from the SRE team just to see logs and see what's happening, but not deploy anything. So it can really customize based on the developer access that you need.
Interesting. This is an interesting subject for me because it kind of blurs the lines of responsibility between developers and operations. So there are two ways you can approach something, right? Especially when it comes to after you've deployed your app, it's out there running happily, but things are happening. Nothing ever changes the same. Nothing ever stays the same. Maybe your app has all of a sudden become extremely popular. There's a few that have come out recently. I won't name. But maybe all of a sudden your application is now scaling like crazy. So on the operations side, they may solve this problem by just making make sure that the scaling is efficient, all of this stuff. But if a developer were to come in and look at that, they might say, this request is really busy at noon every day. Maybe we need to work, down in the details of the code and make that actual process that request is doing, make that more efficient so that it doesn't have to scale so much on the back end. So if you have both sets of eyes looking at it and approaching it from different places, that's pretty powerful.
I agree. And you can do things, for example, if you are part of a team that owns the app, but you later want to bring another team, let's say the developer, you can run an app grant where you can invite another team to have access to your application and basically read logs, see the graphs and the charts. So you can basically give that visualization to your application on a temporary basis, as if you want, or a permanent if you want. But you have those flexibilities, and I agree that can be pretty powerful.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, if it's okay, maybe we can shift the conversation now to the post deployment, right? So now we're in production. I'd like to talk about some best practices and strategies for managing post production in a cloud native environment. Things like security, observability, which we touched on, compliance controls, all those sorts of things. So Melissa, maybe we can start with you on this one.
Sure. So my first experiences on a DevOps team were pretty eye-opening. I had no idea the acrobats that operations was taking to deploy some of the apps that we had. This is when I first started getting interested in containers and stuff. And I know that's another whole thing that can possibly be abstracted away from a developer. But that was something that I was really curious about and got into. So I learned how to build containers efficiently so that they can be deployed more efficiently. But some of the things that happened in my experience was, maybe months after an app was deployed, all of a sudden somebody sends an email, hey, these containers are restarting all the time. Some of our tools that we use to keep our apps up and running are actually, they just cover a problem. And that's one of them, is if a container keeps restarting over and over again, you need to know that there's something wrong, right? I mean, it's one thing if it's once in a blue moon, but there's something wrong if it's happening continuously. And when it keeps recovering like that and no one's paying attention, that's something that can cause some problems for your users. So that's something that I'm curious about with the observability with Shipa. Do you have any kind of like alerting mechanisms or anything like that that we can set up to let us know when things are going wrong, or like when load is especially high, things like that?
Yeah, you can definitely do that, and we have integration into the different incident management tools. For example, you have the simple one as Slack, where if the application is getting restarted, or if someone is making a deployment fails or succeeded, so very detailed level, you can set up alerts on Slack, PagerDuty, VictorOps, and all your other incident management tools where you can alert the developer and so on. And one thing we say is that the more you can focus on the controls and guardrails and less on the infrastructure itself, and just leverage the infrastructure to what it's good for you, and focus on the app and the controls around it, the more actionable items you can have and the more intelligent actionable items you can have, rather than being kind of bogged down by the infrastructure. So what we usually tell folks around that space is focus on what type of application you're running, right? And what type of deployments need to happen, what are the sources, what are the components that are part of it, and what are the controls and the guardrails that you need to set, all the way from alerts to auto scalability of your app, to network policies and so on. So that has to be thought out first, preferably, then kind of an afterthought after application is deployed, because that can bring a lot of complexities later.
Definitely. A developer can only do so much as far as troubleshooting and stuff, or even preventing these problems from happening in production. We can do things like install Docker desktop and with Kubernetes support, or install Minikube or something like that. It'll give us a little one node cluster. But I mean, it's pretty limited. So being able to deploy my app out there into some staging environment or testing environment or dev environment, a pool in Shipa terms, I guess. I think that's really huge, especially if I'm working on one microservice that is a part of many microservices. You know, I might want to just see if my stuff works before I push that stuff out in production. Anyway, where I'm going with this is as a developer, when I mess up my little one node cluster, I finally figured out how to just wipe that thing away and start over, because that happens a lot when you're developing and, you know, doing some stuff by trial and error. So when you're deploying to a Shipa pool and you've messed up the deployment, do I have to wait until I can connect with an ops person to fix it for me?
It goes back to, depends on the permissions that you have. If you're given permissions to basically go through the logs, and directly from Shipa, you can do app shell. So that's going to allow you to shell in directly into your application container, so you can fix and see what's happening there as well. You can, if you have the permission, you can run another deployment. And one last thing that you can do as well is if you share, but one of the things you can see is everything that happened with my application from a lifecycle perspective. So who created the app, when the application was scaled up or down, who deployed what, and you can see the log associated to that. And let's say something happened, you can also do a rollback directly from here. So you can get your application to a state where it was working without complexity and learning, well, how do I do this in Kubernetes and the different clusters and so on. So you have different options there.
Beautiful. That was my next question, is how do I roll back in that worst case scenario when something does make it to production, because it will happen. So you need, as much as we try to avoid it, it will happen someday, and you need a way to take care of it. So your options are either make a change real quick and get it out there, or roll back until you can get that change made if it's more complicated.
Exactly. Yeah.
The other solution is just to only deploy code that never fails.
If only we had figured that out. Why don't we do that? Someone needs to write books about that.
I don't know why. Yeah, no one's ever brought that up before.
and that's why I always tell the engineering team that we should move everything to HTML. We should use only HTML. The chances of failing are so low, but they never actually agree with me. So.
Yeah, this has been a really, really great discussion. I really appreciate both of you guys taking the time here today. I do have to say though, Bruno, every time I talk to you, I think I end up gaining 5 pounds. All this talk about pizza.
That's what I was just thinking. I think that's on my list now, is pizza.
Yeah, I think that's what's going to be on the lunch menu today.
With mushrooms.
With mushrooms, the right ones.
Non-poisonous ones.
Right. Well, before we close this out and I go refill my coffee cup here, I'd like to ask both of you if you have any closing thoughts. Bruno, maybe we can start with you and we'll finish with Melissa if you've got anything you'd like to just add to close out today's discussion.
Well,
not to put you on the spot.
No, that's okay. I think I kind of beat this drum a lot. I beat this drum in my talks just because it was something that I struggled with doing when I was a junior dev. With all the magic that happens behind the scenes, it's easy to never learn what's going on under the covers. And I still think that's very important to do. You should know what's going on with your builds, especially with your software builds. Know where your stuff is coming from. Go through it line by line and understand how your app is being built and put together. And by knowing that process, you're going to be able to have a lot of input in how to make your whole pipeline a lot more efficient. So
yeah,
that's what I'm going to
know. Good to know how to change your tire, but much more fun to call AAA, right?
Yeah, this is true.
True.
Bruno, how about you?
On my side, one thing that I keep saying a lot of the time is define a workflow, right? Today, if you want to build microservices and cloud native at scale, define a well-integrated workflow between your developer and your ops folks and your security folks, right? All the way from my builds to storing my registry, to my CI pipeline, to my deployment and my post deployment, right? Don't really mind about the technology, but define the workflow and then see how that fits. Because one of the talks I've been going through around is Kubernetes will disappear and your developers won't care. At the end of the day, your application is the first class citizen, right? That's what moves your organization. That's what moves your teams. It's not really Kubernetes. Kubernetes is just a mean to deliver it. The same way we went from physical infrastructure to VMs, to containers, Kubernetes, tomorrow maybe serverless, later maybe something else. But if you focus that on that workflow and implement that, then it doesn't really matter the technology you have underneath. Your workflow and your capability of delivering and supporting your apps will keep on point. So I think that's what I expect to see a lot more this year as well.
Great. Thank you, Bruno. And thank you again, Melissa. Thank you, both of you. So with that, I think it's time to wrap up this edition of Coffee and Containers. And I'm going to put all the things we talked about, I'll put in the description of this video, as well as some links to get some more information about both these solutions that we talked about here today. So with that, we'll see all of you guys at the next one. Thank you very much, Bruno and Melissa. We'll see you later.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you.